I'm watching this thing, and like 23 minutes into it, he goes, yeah, I was a kid and I used to go to the House of Guitars. And he holds the bass up, and I'm like, that's the 52 Jazz that used to be above, Precision, that used to be above the door.
If there's anything, that's it. But I so appreciate you doing this. I'm such a fan of the channel and the history of the videos and everything. I was going to ask you just to start, because I was watching this video that Rick Beato did where he found this 52 bass that belonged to his uncle. And Joe Bonamassa bought it. And then
from
you helped
the House
him
of Guitars.
From the House of Guitars, and you helped him reconnect with the bass because you saw the video with Joe Bonamassa. Is that how that story went? What was the story here where you were talking to Rick about and you found the bass?
So the story is Rick and I have been friends since we both worked at Ithaca College in the late 80s. And I actually, without going too far into it, I actually made a video called I Took Lessons with Rick Beato, because Rick Beato was my jazz guitar teacher. And he's 2 years younger than me, but he was right out of New England Conservatory, had just finished doing he did his entire master's program in one calendar year with Mick Goodrick and all the people at New England, 85 or something. He had just come back onto faculty, and the head of the jazz department was like, yeah, I don't want this guy from the admissions taking a guitar lesson from me. I'm going to give you to this junior faculty member. Let me assign to this guy. This Beato is his name. Here's his phone number. Call him. So Rick and I became fast friends then. And so it's a thing where and then when he started we talk. Rick is one of those people who's amazing at staying in touch. He's just incredible about it. Better than anyone I've ever known. And it's not a networking thing. He's from a big family. He would tell you that one of the things he and I have in common is that I grew up in a family of 5. He grew up in a family of 7. He grew up in Fairport. I grew up in Lyons. When we started comparing notes, because he went to school, at Ithaca, but he also was back in Rochester all the time. We were all at these same shows. We'd been at the Weather Report show, in 81 at the Eastman Theater. We were both at the Pat Metheny show in Geneva. It was like this weird thing when we finally met. So we'd been friends, and we literally talk probably 5 or 6 times a week. Like it's a regular ritual. We both finish breakfast. He'll be sitting in his garden and we're talking about things. And he's a great storyteller, obviously. That's the thing that he and I have in common. And we both have pretty serious memories. As Somerset Maugham always said, I have a good memory for things that concern me, which I always thought described memories for everybody. It's like, oh, if it clicks for you, it's going to stick for you. So I didn't mean to make that rhyme. So anyway, Rick had told me this story years ago. And then he was getting this award in the Music Hall of Fame for Rochester Music Hall of Fame. So my fiance and I drove to Rochester. We had lunch with him. And he said, hey, after this, I'm going to go to House of Guitars, with Layla, his daughter. And I'm like, oh, that'd be really cool. I was just there, recently with somebody who follows the channel. And he goes, yeah, that bass. And I said, yeah, you mean your uncle's bass. You think that's your uncle's bass? Because literally, he showed it in the video. His his family lived around literally like 2 blocks from the House of Guitars. So we don't really know how it ended up from the house to the House of Guitars. But the first time I borrowed the car and told my parents I was going into town to get a sub sandwich, I got in the car and I drove to Rochester. Completely had no business driving to Rochester, and I drove to the House of Guitars. So that was the first thing I ever did. Yeah, of course, exactly, right? So, and then there's famous people like, famous Andy Babiuk, who wrote the Beatles gearbooks and the Rolling Stones gearbooks, was a guitar salesman in the late 70s and early 80s at the House of Guitars. So, it was the same. Rick and I were both trying to convince him, not unknowingly, to let us play the late 70s Norland junk Les Pauls. But anyway, that's another story.
Right. Yeah. Wait, so what was Rick teaching you when you would take those early lessons with him? Was he teaching you just jazz theory, and was he a monster player? I'm sure he was, but
yeah, no, absolutely. And he had just finished playing his master's. He has a master's degree in, I'm not sure if it's in composition or if it's in jazz performance, but the reality was when he was in Boston, he was gigging all over town. Fast forward to 2 years ago, I did a video on the history of Gibson jumbo guitars. And there was this beautiful piece of playing on a 57 Southern jumbo that Duke Levine did. And I'm like, oh, well, I've exchanged emails with him before. I don't know him, but I email him and I'm like, at the last minute, I'm like, yeah, I should name drop to get them to give me. And I'm like, I'm a good friend of Rick's and he's mentioned you before. And he writes back and as an upstate New Yorker, he says, any friend of Rick's a friend of mine. I immediately hear sarcasm, not sarcasm. I reach out to Rick. He's like, oh yeah, Duke and I did hundreds of gigs, jazz guitar duets. I'm like, okay, A, that there are gigs for jazz guitar duets in the Boston area, it just freaks me out. But the B, that you guys were so close. He's like, yeah, yeah. You know, Duke's just a few years older than me, went back to school, blah, blah. So yeah. So I knew him through that, and I knew him through other things. And yeah, it's so many connections. You know, it's such a music. I'm sure you're running into this with what you do. It's such a small world in a lot of ways.
Wait, so you see the Rick's uncle's bass in the Bonamassa video, and then it clicks for you that you're like, you just knew that was the bass he was talking about.
Well, 7 years ago, Bonamassa made this video with Reverb, and I watched it. And because of the nature of the channel with the most music, least gear, the whole sort of how much is enough, you know, channel thing, I'm like, well, Joe, again, another upstater, is a poster child for having no sense of what's enough. You know, I mean, just like, and I'm like, okay, so 7 years later, has he come around to wrestling with that? And the answer is he has. You know, he's actually kind of changed the way he's collecting now. And even in that interview, they got him to talk about what he's going to do with it. Like if he dropped dead, what would happen to the collection, it was a beautiful answer. And so I'm watching this thing, and it's a half an hour long or something. And I'm watching the whole thing, and like 23 minutes into it, he goes, yeah, you know, I was a kid and I used to go to the House of Guitars. And he's like, I don't know how much younger than us he is, probably 10, 12 years at least. And he holds the bass up, and I'm like, that's the 52 jazz that used to be above, I mean, precision that used to be above the door. And, you know, and you know what, when I was going under it, all I knew was it was old. I didn't know about blackguards. I didn't know, you know, that 52 was the first year of the P bass. I didn't know any of that stuff. They were just old, and they were so expensive that they were in a case that you could never get them down.
Right.
That's all I knew.
Right.
And so when he held it up and he said that, I immediately texted Rick, and I'm like, yeah, that's the bass. If that's the one, that has to be it. And Rick's family had been telling that story for years too. And the only, I don't want to throw any shade on the House of Guitars, but the only thing about them was they would never get those down and show them to anybody. You're kind of like, you don't want to show me the serial number on that. Okay.
That's every guitar store though. Every
that's
guitar
true.
store you go to growing up,